Welcome to this week's Bible reading and my reflections on it. This week's reading comes from the Old Testament, from the Book of Exodus. Passages Exodus chapter 1, starting at verse 8, and I shall read through until chapter 2, verse 10. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." Do you ever wonder where God is? Do you ever wonder what he's doing in your own life? If I asked you what you had been doing this last week, everybody would be able to say something. You'd be able to remember and tell me at least some of what you've been up to. But if I asked you what God had been doing this last week in your life, that might be a bit more difficult to say. What about what God has been doing since the beginning of the year for you, or in the last few years? Christians believe that God is with us all the time. He's not like an inanimate comfort blanket or a big teddy that we carry around with us. God is at work and God communicates with us. But it's not always easy to see what he is doing or to hear what he is saying, particularly at the time. There are portions of narrative in the Old Testament when God is very active. He gets into conversations with people. He directs operations. There are other portions of narrative when God isn't mentioned at all. Many of you will know the story of Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob. He was Jacob's favorite son. Jacob gave him a gift of a special coat, which made his older brothers jealous, and they started to hate him. He then had two dreams, which seemed to indicate that there would come a time when his parents and his older brothers would bow down to him. When Joseph told his brothers and father about these dreams, his brothers' animosity grew. So the brothers plotted to kill Joseph. When the chance arose to kill him, one of his brothers, Reuben, persuaded the others not to do so, but to put him down a pit. He was hoping to rescue Joseph later on. It just so happened that some traders were passing that way on their way to Egypt, and the other brothers decided, rather than leaving Joseph to die in the pit, that it would be better to sell him to these traders. So that's what they do. They sell Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. And these traders take Joseph to Egypt. Throughout this part of the narrative, God is not mentioned. So how interesting that many years later, when there is a family reunion in Egypt, Joseph, who is now second in command after the Pharaoh, says to his brothers, "It was not you who sent me here, but God." And he says this 3 times in just a few verses. God sent me here. There is an acknowledgement that despite appearances, God was in control of events all the time. Joseph, as a person of faith, could see that as he looked back on his life. All that he had to endure, all the suffering he'd been through, was for the purpose of being able to save his family, the ones chosen by God to be his people, from whom would come a great nation, to save them from famine. So he says, God sent me before you to preserve life. Perhaps when people of faith look back, possibly further than last week, we can see how God has been working in our lives in ways that we do not recognize at the time. Perhaps now we do see how God was at work, because now we see him giving purpose to whatever it is that we've been through. And we need to retell our stories with God as a participant, as Joseph did. In today's Old Testament reading, we hear about events after Joseph had died. We hear about a new Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, or presumably how his family arrived in Egypt, then grew and grew in numbers. All he knew is that he had a large number of foreigners, the Israelites or Hebrews, descendants of Jacob, living in his land, and he didn't trust them. In the eyes of the new Pharaoh, the Israelites were becoming more numerous and more powerful than they, the Egyptians, were. He thought in the event of war they might join with Egypt's enemies. So he starts oppressing them. They're used as slave labor. Where is God? What is God doing for his people? The Pharaoh's strategy of oppressing the Israelites isn't working. They are becoming even more numerous, we're told. So, reading verse 13 and 14, the Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. There's still no mention of God and what he's doing. And then we meet two women of faith, two Hebrew or Israelite midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. They provide a chink of light in the darkness because they are not bound by fear of the Egyptian king. We are told they fear God. They are going to do what is right in God's eyes. They defy the king's orders to kill all the boy babies born to Israelite mothers. That their God is working through these two women, saving the lives of these babies. When questioned by the king about why there are still Hebrew boys growing up in their midst, these two women of faith come up with a reason. I assume it's a lie. They say that Hebrew women give birth so quickly that they don't have time to get there and kill the newborns. They lie to save lives. And we hear that God dealt well with these midwives. And the people multiplied and became very strong. And God blesses Shiphrah and Puah, giving them their own families because they feared God. They did the right thing. God's people are still oppressed. They're still working as slaves. But God is there. God is at work too, through the actions of these two faithful women. Then we hear that the Egyptian king has another go at wiping out the Hebrews. He can see his strategy with the midwives isn't working, so he tells his own people to throw every Hebrew boy that is born into the Nile. How on earth can God's people, the Israelites, survive now? But of course they do. We hear the story of how one Israelite baby boy survived, how his mother was paid by the Pharaoh's daughter to take care of him, and how he ended up living in the Pharaoh's own household. It's a well-known story of Moses. When we read the account in the Bible of Moses being put by his mother in a waterproof basket in the reeds at the bank of the river, and the baby's sister keeping watch, and the Pharaoh's daughter finding the basket and her taking pity on the baby when he started crying, there's no mention of God. When Moses' sister suggests to Pharaoh's daughter that she should find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby, and then Pharaoh's daughter agrees to her, unbeknownst to her, the baby's mother, again, there is no mention of God. When we hear that after the child grew up, he became part of the Egyptian royal household, again, there is no mention of God. Moses' survival seems to have come about because of human resourcefulness on the part of Moses' mother and her daughter, and because of good fortune in the responses of Pharaoh's daughter to this baby. But as we read on, as we read about the role that God had for Moses, we surely see God at work from the very moment he was born. As with Joseph, surely God was in control all the time. There was purpose in Moses becoming part of the Egyptian royal household, and all the events that led up to that happening also now take on a purpose and a significance. as we think about where we are now, the home we live in, the neighbours we have, the friends we have, and how we got to where we are now, do you see how God has been at work to get you there? Do you see that God has a purpose for you being where you are now? I have a story to tell about how I came to be ordained and how I came to be here in Wyoming. One version of the story would talk about everything I did and everything those around me did to get me here. The other version would be to acknowledge that God has been at work, that it's through him that I am here now. I certainly didn't always see God at work at the time, but as I look back now, I can see how he's weaved events together to get me here. We reinterpret events. We need to reinterpret events in the light of their significance. We need to reinterpret events as we see what God has done to get us where he wants us to be and to do what he wants us to do. Jesus's very first disciples had to reinterpret. They had to reinterpret Jesus's crucifixion. At first, it seemed like a tragedy and the end of the Jesus movement and the end of God's kingdom here on earth. But a few days later, they saw it very differently. They saw it as a place of victory of good over evil. They saw it as the means of their and our forgiveness and our reconciliation with God. Jesus' death wasn't a sad ending to their time with Jesus, but the beginning of a marvelous new way of being, living an abundant life in relationship with God. The first disciples' reinterpretation of Jesus' death started after Jesus' resurrection, and as they began to experience the new life that Jesus' death brought about for them. So that today we celebrate or proclaim Jesus' death when we share bread and wine together. We see it and understand it as something to celebrate. I would encourage you to take some time to put God into your stories, into your histories. He was with you. He was at work. He was leading you. He was guiding you in ways that you may not have been aware of at the time. He has put you where you are now for a purpose. If you're aware that you're not in the right place, then God surely will open a door for you to go through to get you out of your situation. Possibly it may be that God sends you someone like those Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, people of faith, as lifesavers. Or it may be that you may have to act like Shiphrah and Puah. So let's pause. Let's thank God for the way he's been at work in our lives up till now. And let's look forward with hope that he will continue to work in our lives. Let's pray that we will be able to see God working all things together for good, for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Amen.